So welcome everyone to Arthritis Consumer Experts Biosimilars in Canada, what inflammatory arthritis patients need to know session. We're really pleased to be here with you today. As with all of ACE's activities, whether in person, in print, or online, we disclose all of our sources of funding so that you can judge for yourselves whether we walk our talk. We are thankful for the in-kind support and the financial support that we receive from those listed on this slide. We assure our members and colleagues, both health professional, academic, and government, that our work is free from the influence of our funders. Today's presenters, myself, I probably know many of you on the line. I am the founder and president of Arthritis Consumer Experts. I've been providing national leadership in the community for almost 30 years now and have been involved in both regulatory and reimbursement policy development discussions since 2009. We're really privileged to be joined by Dr. John Esdale, who is the Scientific Director of Arthritis Research Canada and is a world-leading clinical and public health researcher. I'm not sure Dr. Esdale's aware of this or not, but I've been told by his executive assistant that he has 241 refereed papers published in high-impact factor journals. He has been practicing in rheumatology and treating patients with inflammatory arthritis of all types for over 35 years. So we're very, very fortunate to have Dr. Esdale with us here today. And without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Esdale, and these are the things we're going to accomplish over the next 45 or so minutes, leaving time for questions. Dr. Esdale is going to talk to us about originators and biosimilars. Both are biologics. One is an originator, one's biosimilar. We're going to give you an overview of biologic biosimilars from a regulatory perspective in Canada. And we're also going to share with you research and policy updates, talk to you about ACE's views, and then provide you with some key takeaways, and then hopefully have a few minutes at the end for some questions. If in fact you have questions as we proceed, we would like you to please feel free to use the chat feature, and we will record those questions. If in fact we don't have time to answer all of them, we will certainly reply to all by email and as well through a notice in Joint Health Express. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. John Esdale. As I mentioned, he's the Scientific Director of Arthritis Research Canada.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Well, what are biologics, originators, and the biosimilars? Clearly, for people with inflammatory arthritis, they know that biologic medications have incredibly altered the landscape and made life better, prolonged survival for years, added years to the lives of people. Biologics come from living organisms, from many different sources, can be human, animal, or microorganisms, and they're made through biotechnology. They're derived from natural sources, or the actual basis is, or sometimes can be synthetic. Unlike chemical pharmaceuticals, the pills that we go to the pharmacy and get, over the counter, something like an aspirin or prescribed like a penicillin, biologics come from living organisms. They are actually produced by a living organism functioning and creating the medication. The biologics are much more difficult to characterize than a chemical agent like aspirin, penicillin, and so on. And this is very much due to the fact they're huge. They're very large molecules. Biologics manufacturing has been described as the process is the product, which is a little different from chemical drugs. And the differences between the chemical drugs, the aspirins and so on, and biologics require differences in the way they're regulated, which means how the decision is made that we as patients can have access to them. As you see here, there's an aspirin molecule, 21 atoms. We all remember that H2O is water, and that's 3 atoms, so aspirin is a little bigger, but not a lot bigger. Human growth hormone, for which is a large molecule, is about 3,000 atoms. And biologic molecules often contain antibodies, and here's the size of an IgG antibody of 23,000 atoms. So if you think of a chemical drug like your fingernail, then a biologic drug is sort of like an elephant. Very big, very complex. Now, there are different names. Biosimilars, you may also see things biosimilar DMARDs, which is disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs. They are both the same. And a biosimilar is a drug that comes after the originator's patent expires. So when one creates a new biologic medication, the company would be given a patent. It lasts 20 years from the moment they apply for the patent. And then once it expires, one is now allowed to create a biosimilar. They are made from the same building blocks as the originator biologic, but if you look at them in incredible detail, they are not 100% identical. Whether you get aspirin or any of the 20 generic types of acetylsalicylic acid, they're the same. They have 21 atoms, and one can create those 21 atoms very easily in an identical manner. Biologics come from a living cell line, and it's never possible to duplicate something 100%. You can get very close. The biosimilars can enter the market subsequent to the originator after demonstrating to Health Canada in Canada and the Food and Drug Administration in the US and the EMA in Europe that the similarity to the originator includes structural similarity. It looks very, very, very similar. It works the same way. It functions the same way. And then there are non-clinical toxicology studies and some clinical studies. Here we have just some of those studies outlined. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Basically, you want to know that the molecule looks like physically and chemically the originator. You want to know that it works the same, so that if, let's say it was an anti-TNF, that what it does is it interacts with TNF to the same way, the same strength, and with the same effect as the originator. Obviously, all agents have to be proven to not be toxic. That's a good idea. And then finally, there are pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic studies, which are nice expensive words, meaning that when you put the drug in a human, it's handled the same way as the originator. The level goes up to the same level in the blood, that it lasts as long, and so on. And of course, that it's safe, it's effective, and that there is no immunogenicity to it, meaning that it becomes a target of the body's immune system. Here's a nice picture that Cheryl has obtained. One on the left is the reference drug, and you see how it is. And on the right, there is the biosimilar medication, and marked in the yellow is the change, that there's a little bit, that's a tiny bit different in the molecule, one to the other. Now, well, the biologics, both the originator and the biosimilar, are made in batches. And so we saw a batch of the originator, we saw a batch of the biosimilar, and it was a little different. The batches of the biologic originators are different from each other. Every time one makes a new batch, there can be very tiny differences from an earlier one. And the companies, of course, do the studies necessary to show that they're safe, they're efficacious, and they work the same. what we know is that the biosimilars difference from the originator tends to be very similar to the originator differences from one batch to another. So that's rather key, that these very, very complex molecules are never the same. The critical thing is that they have to be extremely biosimilar, as the originators have to be very close to the originator molecule. This is checked by the regulators like Health Canada, and the active substances that are actually in a biosimilar and the reference originator biologic have to be similar. Now here you can see different batches with slightly different changes. The critical thing is that the changes have to be very, very minor, and they have to not affect the function. You have to have the same benefit and the same safety. Now this is kind of frightening. This is what's happening in Canada for biosimilars. It's called a pipeline. It sort of describes all of the companies that are making 4 of the biosimilars. Infliximab, where the originator you would know is Remicade. Etanercept, you might know as Enbrel. Adalimumab, you might know as Humira. And rituximab is Rituxan. Those are the originator names. And what you can see in this target, this bullseye, is the blue dots are drugs that have filed with the government, and some of them are now available. A couple of them are available. I think a third is about to be available, that you could be prescribed it. And then the next circle is all of the green ones, different companies, or some of them are some of the same companies, but different drugs from a variety of companies, and they're getting very close to filing. Then the next dark blue circles are just they're really getting going on applied studies, and the outer circle are people who are biologics that are really very early on in development. But you can see there's going to be a lot of just those 4 originator molecules, potentially a lot. And we have an infliximab and 2 etanercepts that are available. So where are we? What's all this mean? Well, biosimilars have been used in Europe for a decade, and for arthritis biosimilars since 2013. So they have much more experience than we have. An interesting fact is there are more biological originators and biosimilars now in use in inflammatory arthritis than for any other disease. So this is a very important topic, obviously, to the people making the drugs, the companies making the drugs, and also to regulatory bodies and those of us who are patients. The European team, who seem to always be ahead, have approved 28 biosimilars between 2006 and 2017. There are 6 biosimilars currently approved in Canada, and we'll skip the first 3. You can see that second is insulin, so we all know what that is for diabetes. And then the last 3 are the ones that have been approved in Canada for arthritis. So infliximab, and then 2 types of etanercept from 2 different companies. Biosimilars are reviewed in a special pathway by Health Canada, because obviously the review of a 21-atom aspirin for a copy and a review of a 23,000-atom protein is much more complicated. So that makes a lot of sense. And then there is a numbering system that I think we really don't need to know. At least, maybe what I should say is I don't know and I don't want to know. One of the things that Health Canada and the other major regulators around the world are thinking about when they look at a biosimilar, well, we sort of know it, we've touched on it, is it physiochemically the same? does it work the same? Is it doing the same thing? So for an anti-TNF, does it target anti-TNF, and does it do it with the same strength and way? Is it safe? And then does the molecule, once you put it into a person, behave in the same manner and hang around in the same way and be handled in the same way as the original molecule? Then one has to show that you can give it, that the dosing is appropriate, and often show that it's in a study, a randomized study in humans, that it's doing what you think it does. Biosimilars can receive all the indications, so that's the diseases or condition for which the drug is allowed to be given by the regulator, based on the evidence they submit and on decisions. The final decision, of course, rests with the regulator. Will the biosimilar have the same indications as the originator? And the answer is not necessarily. They can apply for all of the same sort of diseases, to use it for the same diseases as the originator. But the company who's made the biosimilar may decide not to go after all the indications. Sometimes an originator has more than one patent, so that a patent for, say, rheumatoid arthritis was given before a patent for, say, spondylitis, and therefore one has to match the patent for the disease. And finally, Health Canada sometimes says that they don't consider the biosimilar to be eligible for a certain medical condition based on their own scientific review. Here's what's been happening in Canada. In 2015, the biosimilar for infliximab was approved for rheumatoid arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, psoriatic arthritis, ulcerative colitis, and Crohn's. So a big, long list of diseases, and it took about a year, as you can see in the next little arrowhead, for it to be added to private insurers and public insurers, so that you and I could not only be prescribed it, but get coverage for it, either from the government or an insurer. That same year, the first etanercept came out, called Brenzys, and it's been approved for rheumatoid arthritis and ankylosing spondylitis. It was not approved for psoriatic arthritis, which etanercept, the originator, is approved for. And a year later, it was approved by private insurers and governments. A new etanercept has just come out, Arelsi, made by a different company, and it has approvals for rheumatoid arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, and juvenile idiopathic arthritis. And it's not yet totally available across the country, but I think will be probably soon. So the question I think that's really relevant is, how safe are these biologic biosimilars, for you or me, if we're receiving one? Well, both Health Canada and the companies have to monitor what's going on. There's market surveillance by Health Canada. They monitor adverse reaction reports. And if someone writes in and says they had a problem, they investigate quite extensively. The manufacturers also have an interest and a legal requirement to monitor side effects. They don't want to be letting something get out of hand. And any serious side effect, which is described under the law, has to be reported immediately within 24 hours to Health Canada. Plus, of course, they need to go back to Health Canada if they're making changes in the manufacturing process, if they want to get a different dosing approval, say a bigger dose or a less frequent dose or a more frequent dose, anything like that. And for any new recommended disease that it would be used for. All that has to go back and be totally reviewed by Health Canada. Now, Cheryl's asked me to touch upon the great debate at the American College of Rheumatology meetings in San Diego. A couple of weeks ago, there was a debate between two incredibly eminent American physicians, very knowledgeable, who've been involved in studying biologics and biosimilars. Jonathan Kay took the pro and Roy Fleischman took the con. Jonathan Kay on the pro side noted there were multiple trials of biosimilars in rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, as well as the other diseases we've touched on, and really little or no differences whatsoever between the biosimilars and the originator product. And he pointed out, once approved, a biosimilar is like any other batch of its reference product. So there can be little differences, as there can be in the originator. He noted that the differences between biosimilars and originators over time in batches is probably going to be exceedingly close to each other. There's a certain sort of variability. In Norway, the infliximab is now priced 69% below the cost of the reference product. And this has led to, in Norway, where the government really decides to a quite a large extent who's going to get what, that people are switched. And this is happening across the European Union. And in some countries, people have been switched from the originator to a biosimilar, and then a new biosimilar comes along and is cheaper still, and the government dictates that one switch to that one. A big study in Norway showed randomized study in which people on the originator infliximab were randomized to receive either the originator or the biosimilar. They could have a group of diseases that you can see there: spondylitis, psoriatic arthritis, RA, and ankylosing spondylitis. And basically, the study showed non-inferiority, is the scientific name, meaning they're very, very, very similar. They've had a follow-up study on it, which just came out, was presented a couple of weeks ago, for an additional 26 weeks. That first one was 52 weeks, again showing that as the study's been extended, there was really no differences between those on infliximab who stayed on infliximab, the originator, or went on infliximab, the biosimilar. That one note is that while they both worked the same, it was more likely that people stopped their biosimilar for not things that could be measured by the doctor, but things that could be measured by the patient. Another study, switching study in the Netherlands on etanercept, found only 2% discontinued. Dr. Kane has referred to the Nocebo Effect, that knowing that there's been this change sometimes makes people a little more anxious. But in any event, this is something that's going to be followed very closely. Now the con, so the person talking about it against the biosimilars, actually agreed that biosimilars were as effective and as safe as described by Dr. Kay, who was giving the pro side. He noted that the reason that biosimilars were thought to be of value would be that they were as effective, they were safe, and supposed to be cheaper. And he went on at great length that in the United States there were no savings. It was like a 15% reduction at best, and much of the benefit was not going to the patient. Many patients pay for things in the United States, or they have insurance that's incomplete, but was going to pharmacy benefit managers and not to the patients. So he was pretty upset about that. He mentioned that the nocebo effect of people changing just because they were anxious, that's life and that's the clinical reality. He believes that up to 20% of patients had problem switching, but because they lost clinical effect, he feels that switching may not work for every patient. We have to remember, of course, that if you look at patients on even the originator, they do stop working in some people and have to be stopped, so that, fortunately, we no longer have just one biologic medication, we have a dozen. And so if one stops working, it's not the end of the world. Anyway, the bottom line is that in the US, There's not a lot of access for biosimilars yet, and there's not a lot of price savings. But both of Dr. Fleischman and Dr. K feel they're safe and effective. I think I've mentioned the switching study, so we don't need to go there. That really, it looks like even in the extension, the originator infliximab and the biosimilar infliximab continue to have very, very similar results. And Cheryl asked me to point out that obviously people are following this. There are big registries in many European countries where access to these drugs came some years ago, just tracking everybody in, say, the country, or as many people as possible in the country, to make certain that there are no surprises. Here's so just for one biosimilar group, the anti-TNF group, so that's sort of etanercept, infliximab, certolizumab, adalimumab, and I've forgotten one. Most of the studies, 46% are from gastroenterology, 44% have been done in rheumatology, 4% in dermatology, and then just a scattering 2% in unknown things, and 4% were done in preliminary fashion in perfectly healthy people to make sure all was good. So what do we know? The pharmacokinetics, what happens in the body is similar. For both the originator and the biosimilar, the efficacy, how they work, is similar. There may be differences in anti-drug antibodies. We don't really have a huge amount of data, but we're not terribly worried about that, to be quite honest. And in some studies where it's been looked at, the originator was more likely to lead to antibodies than the biosimilar. There are huge cost savings potentially if you have a sensible government system and private industry. Then you could, with biosimilars, you will be getting a lower price. We are going to need to keep following biosimilars in the real world and make sure that they're living up to everything we believe they will and the government believes they will. It's uncertain how we should transition people from an originator to a biosimilar. I think my key takeaways are biosimilars are extremely biosimilar. If you have two elephants and one has a pimple, it really isn't material. And that's sort of what the science is suggesting right now. They've been extensively evaluated by groups like the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the European EMA, and Health Canada, and they're all finding similar things. There's going to be batch-to-batch difference, whether it be originator or biosimilars, and this is not being of any concern as there's a very narrow range in which the difference is allowed or you don't get access to them. There's no doubt that biosimilars in Canada will be cheaper, much cheaper. They will provide identical benefit at half the price. So from my perspective, the money saved on using a biosimilar rather than an originator with an expired patent will be needed to pay for brand new expensive drugs that are becoming available and that we're going to need them. We're going to need them to improve the quality of life of people with arthritis and survival, their length of living. I think the conversation, what happens between rheumatologists and their patients, is really critical in the future that's going to be coming up when we may have to transition people who are on an originator to a biosimilar. And it's important that the more patients know and the more we rheumatologists know, the better. So thank you very much. I've enjoyed that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Esdale. I know that there are probably lots of questions formulating in your heads. Please feel free to use the chat feature as we move along, or you can email those directly to us at ACE, and we'll deal with them after the webinar. I'm going to take you, turn us from the clinical and the research perspective into one of, I guess, where the rubber hits the road, and that's out in the policy realm. and with payers, and both public and private, and talk to you about some of the positions that have been taken. But I'm going to start off by just clarifying terminology that ACE has developed and used. Rather than use the term switching, Arthritis Consumer Experts has begun to talk about transition. Switching, if you look in the dictionary actually, and the term switcheroo, is often regarded as a negative word. And I think if you heard from Dr. Esdale about the Nocebo Effect, it's actually the conversation and the words you use in the conversation that either leads a patient and their physician to confidence in therapy, whether it be an originator biologic or a biosimilar. And so the words become very important. So medical transition is someone not doing well. That happens regrettably every day in rheumatology and in patients like myself and those who are participating in this webinar. That's a medical transition. It means your therapy is not working and you need to change your therapy. So many of us have had that conversation probably a dozen or more times in our life with disease. The second one is policy transition, and that really is, we think, the meat of the matter in biosimilars and biologic originators right now. We refer to policy transitions. You often hear of this as non-medical switching, which is policy that necessitates patients to change their medicine of choice, so the one that they started on, to another, typically less expensive medicine, not for a medical reason. So we call that a policy transition. It will be interesting for, I think, those of you participating to learn that the FDA and other regulators are now beginning to use the word transition more commonly, because in fact it does transition is a word that speaks to the intention of moving someone from one molecule to another. In terms of a policy update, I think it's really important for all of us in Canada and around the world to understand that regulators are working in collaboration, that the EMA, the FDA, and Health Canada and others are very, very invested in what the other is doing, because it's very important at the end of the day for patients to understand that there is regulatory alignment. They have regular, what they call cluster teleconferences with the FDA, the EMA, Japan's Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices Agency, and bilateral conversations with other regulators outside of this group to discuss specific issues that may be of interest to them, or ones that are concerning or difficult in the terms of regulatory framework, either expansion or clarification. We also participate in the International Pharmaceutical Regulators Forum, Biosimilars Working Group, the WHO, which is the World Health Organization, Biosimilar Guideline Drafting Groups, and of course our own International Regulatory Forum session on biosimilars. So Canada is very much taking a leadership position when it comes to biosimilars. For those of you who are with us from the United States, it's not, I don't think, a surprise to you to know that all biosimilar products currently approved obviously meet the FDA's standards for approval for the indications that have been described in their product labeling. A biosimilar approved by the FDA, it basically, as Dr. Esdale highlighted for us with the Health Canada procedure, it has no clinically meaningful difference. And as of last month, the FDA has approved 7 biosimilars, and some of those are already on the market, although what we heard from Dr. Roy Fleischman was that the promise of savings isn't there, but it's as a result of the healthcare system in the United States. Canada, we think, has a real opportunity to benefit from I think a primary piece of innovation that biosimilars bring, which is cost savings. This is just really to remind us that biosimilars and interchangeable products can be used in patients who've previously been treated with the reference product and who have not been previously received the reference product or treatment naive. So before the approval of the biosimilar product, the FDA may request additional information. So this is really the FDA working on trying to wrestle to the ground that the subject of interchangeability. Interchangeability really happens typically at the pharmacy counter. And this is something, I think there's been some fear-mongering that's gone on in our community with the thought that, the pharmacist is going to sort of run crazy and be transitioning people without their knowledge or without their rheumatologist knowledge, and that's not going to be the case when it comes to either biologic originators or biologic biosimilars. The rheumatologist in Canada needs to write the script, and so these are some key differences. But in the United States, they're really trying to determine whether there is the ability to interchange an originator to a biosimilar at the pharmacy counter. But we certainly have not pursued, Health Canada has not pursued that, nor have manufacturers. If we turn our view over across the pond to Europe, as Dr. Esdale said, there are 28 biosimilars, and there have been no concerns in terms of safety of those approved currently. If we look at CADTH, which is the group in Canada that looks at determining whether a product's coming to market at an efficient price, they have shown that the use of biosimilars in the European Union is expected to result in overall savings of between 11.8 billion euro and 33.4 billion euro only in the next 1 or 2 years. The EMA, so the European Medicines Agency, which is the group that manages the regulatory environment for the European Union, has produced a couple of really nice guides, and these are referenced at the end of the slide deck, which when we post this live to our website, you'll have access to all of the references that we've relied on in the preparation of this webinar. Like in the EU, the ruling regulatory body leaves the decision on a policy framework guiding the use of biosimilars to individual member countries. So this would be similar to our provincial or territorial policy decision-making in Canada. So in terms of how they're used at the provincial level, the EMA also provides that freedom of how they actually place these in therapy in their particular jurisdiction from a payment perspective. The EU member countries, they generally agree to the fact that the EU authorized biosimilars are considered the therapeutic choice, alternative choice to their respective originator biologic, and that is under the supervision of a clinical decision maker. So there is the active knowledge of a clinical decision maker, a rheumatologist, and their patient involved at the time of transition or initial prescription. The majority of countries, including those that are listed here, do support physician-led switching or transitioning for biosimilars. So what's currently being discussed in Canada, the European Union is certainly far ahead of us. As of March 2017, there is a convergence across the EU countries that biologics should not be substituted at the pharmacy level. So I mentioned that a minute ago, again, without the involvement of the clinical decision maker. So these are assurances, I think, that are really important to patients and our rheumatologists in Canada and those of us on the line who are health educators. So this is a carefully considered policy viewpoint, and one that I think you'll be hearing more about in the coming weeks and months. It's just interesting to note in terms of position statements. There actually isn't great support from the Crohn's colitis community or gastrointestinal community here in Canada for transitioning. However, in Europe, it is not only embraced, it is their publicly accepted position. The same is true for the European Society for Medical Oncology and of course for the consortium of individual regulators in the EU. If we look at Canada specifically, Health Canada, and this is really important, they have been very diligent on keeping their fact sheets on biosimilars, their regulatory statements. They don't really hold positions. Health Canada holds statements. And their fact sheet, again, it will be referenced at the end of this deck, really clearly spells out what, in fact, they feel is the current state of science vis-a-vis interchangeability and switching, or what we call transitioning. So Health Canada now, as of August, considers well-controlled switches or transitions, policy transitions from reference biologic drug to biosimilar in an approved indication to be acceptable. So this is a significant, I think, move in the last 6 months. And I think they've now taken this statement, made this statement publicly and within their regulatory environment due to the numbers of patients that are being successfully transitioned in the EU, and certainly motivated in part by the savings that come with it, cost savings that come with it. Of course, Health Canada is still really recommending that those decisions stay between patients and physicians in terms of the conversation. So while it can be mandated by policy, they really underscore how the consultation between the patient and the physician is really, really important, even when it takes into the account the policy of the relevant jurisdiction. Interchangeability is very specific. It's different than transitioning or switching. It really talks about legislation that allows for the ability for a patient to be changed from one drug to another equivalent drug by a pharmacist without the intervention of the doctor who wrote the prescription. So interchangeability is not happening. It's not discussed in Canada. And I think, we need to really be focused on the things that are happening versus the things that aren't happening in Canada. If we take a look quickly at the biosimilar reimbursement policies that exist today, so as Dr. Esdale mentioned, 3 have been approved for use. 2 have been placed on public and private formularies, and they're shown there on the left. In newly started patients, so in patients who have never been on infliximab or etanercept, they will be reimbursed only for infliximab, Inflectra, and etanercept Brenzys. And I want to underscore there that is for patients that are newly started. So they've never been on infliximab, whether an originator or biosimilar, and they've never been on etanercept, again, whether on an originator or biosimilar. So the one that will be paid for is the biosimilar. And most private health insurance plans mirror provincial reimbursement policy, so that would certainly be true. That's an important piece, actually, on the private side, because there are a number of plans that are sponsored by employers where lifetime limits for biologic reimbursement have been placed. So in effect, it means that someone could be getting several years more of their therapy paid for by their insurance if, in fact, they are being put on the less expensive biologic, the biosimilar. Same efficacy, same safety, lower price. In terms of who's currently, the column now on the right, patients currently on a biologic originator that has an approved biologic biosimilar in place, so the 3 we've previously mentioned, it shows you there that no province yet requires patients to policy transition from their originator to its biologic biosimilar. And no private health insurer yet requires that. However, we do know from being invited into consultations with government, representing certainly our members and the viewpoint of people living with inflammatory arthritis, that those are things that are being discussed. The rheumatology community is being consulted, and I think what's really positive about that is its discussions are happening in a very equitable, collaborative manner, which is, I think, very unique in Canada in terms of our disease community versus others. There's been a great spirit of sort of roll up your sleeves and let's try to determine what the challenges are and try to find ways to overcome them that we can all live with. You should also be aware that rheumatologists across Canada are now regularly prescribing biosimilars for those newly initiated on either infliximab or etanercept. And also in full consultation with their patient, they're beginning to voluntarily transition them from originator to biosimilar given the safety and efficacy, high degree of similarity, and the desire to have patients on a therapy that will be affordable not only to the healthcare system, but to patients themselves should in fact they have to pay any portion or the entire amount out of pocket, which sadly there are some patients who are having to do that. I'd like to conclude this section. Just one of the things that you wanted to have was an unbiased information source. And about a year ago, Arthritis Consumer Experts took it upon itself to gather all this evidence up, the research, the regulatory evidence, and statements and positions around the world, as well as policy information at the provincial level, so reimbursement information. And it's all rolled up into one nice place called the Biosimilar Exchange. So it's on our website. There's the URL. We really encourage you not only to use it as a resource for your organization or members or fellow patients, but to share it as well. In terms of cost savings, there's no question that when you're in the right healthcare system, in the right environment, biosimilars can save significant amounts of money. And I want to remind everyone that biosimilars enter the marketplace like a generic medication does because the patent of the originator has expired. So they've lived their life, they've made a lot of money, and now it's time for another product to come in its place. And biosimilars are those products. It has been noted that a competitive and sustainable market for biosimilar and innovator drugs can actually work together and offer really great benefits to the healthcare system, and that's certainly of interest to our organization and our 40,000 members across the country. It is noted that in healthcare systems that are national, truly national healthcare systems, ours is supposed to be, but we know that the delivery happens at a provincial level, but we're certainly closer to a national healthcare system than the United States. And in these types of systems, you can see there that there's 40 to 70% less expense of biologic originators. So those are real hard savings that are coming in the cases of the countries that I've listed there and others. When we look at our own pricing regulator group, the Patented Medicines Pricing Review Board, they conducted research and they have found that by next year, the savings for infliximab alone can go from $91 million to $514 million just in the space of another month or two. So that's actually quite exciting if in fact you have somewhere to spend the money, and we know that in arthritis we have some places that we'd like to spend the money. So quickly I'm going to take you through some of ACEs. I should also note I was at a biosimilar conference last month in Calgary, and there were a number of researchers and clinicians in the room, and someone from Alberta Health gave a presentation. And she said that had all of the patients that were on infliximab and newly initiated patients, if they were to have gone on infliximab and Flectra, their actual savings because of newly initiated were $750,000. Had all patients in the province of Alberta gone on infliximab and Flectra at the time of its availability, their savings would have been $50 million. So these are real dollars. Those are real differences. In terms of ACEs views, I think it's fairly clear through these data if in fact if you embrace the independent investigator data that we've provided, government data, they are safe and effective. I think that debate is long gone. There's no question that biosimilars may even have some advantages because of improvements in manufacturing processes, delivery devices, among other aspects. Similar to legislated generic drug savings in Canada, biologic biosimilars offers the potential to save public and private healthcare system billions of dollars, and that's just full stop. There's no, I think, debating that if in fact they're listed in a safe, effective, and equitable way. Policy development, we think, has to involve credible patient and rheumatologists who fully disclose their sources of funding from manufacturers. It is no surprise that the industry of biologic manufacturing, whether originators or biosimilars, they represent a lot of dollars spent. And they spend on programming, they spend on support, and as long as those supports are fully disclosed, then we have an idea whether a perspective is generated from evidence or elsewhere. Policy transitioning ACE's views from its board, its members, and its management, senior management team of people with arthritis is that policy transition is appropriate if the prescribing physician and their patient have both the education and information tools they need to support them in all aspects of their transitioning, from care coach. The biggest issue when you start a biologic, and I speak from personal experience, and maybe this resonates in some of you on the line, is getting started, is getting the insurance forms filled in, getting your HAC forms filled out. And then once you've begun, it's fairly seamless. Finding your infusion center, having the first infusion. It's the first of everything that are the most important, and we think that that's where the education information should really focus. We think government should reinvest policy transition savings in a timely manner, and we see this as an integral piece of innovating inflammatory models of care. We always should have the tools that enable us to discuss both the pros and the cons of all treatments with our healthcare team. And patients who are policy transitioned need to know that their transition and things, the clinical outcomes, will be monitored as part of their routine care, as with all of their other medications. Outcomes data should be collected and is being collected on patients in whom multiple transitions are made, and that's true whether it's a biosimilar or a biologic originator. So we are of the conclusion that policy transitions are safe and highly cost-effective. It's the how that is the most important part for patients and rheumatologists and policymakers. There are no safety and efficacy concerns at this point. As we've said, I think Dr. Resdale noted in his piece of this presentation and my own that it's clear communication about why policy transition can be beneficial to individual patients, groups of patients, and ultimately society. And that is the most important conversation we feel we can have right now. We need to find a way to focus on that conversation here in Canada and elsewhere, that it be based on the safety and efficacy evidence, be positive, and not fuel fear-mongering, which we think is the way the conversation has gone on in Canada over the last year. And it's been very troubling to patients, first and foremost, not to hear consistent things from the community. I think is troubling, and I think that's something that we can all positively address. Arthritis Consumer Experts and Arthritis Research Canada are part of a working group with provincial governments to ensure that arthritis research and patient perspectives are front and center in policy development. We're currently working on those conversation guides that will help support rheumatologists and allied health professions in their policy transition conversations with their patients. So I think those points are all fairly clear. We want to take this opportunity to thank you very, very much for participating. I know that we've had a few questions that have come up, and we're going to go ahead and take those by email, and we'll make certain to notify you when the presentation is loaded live. As I said, you'll have all of the information that was referenced included in a very robust appendix to the meeting slide deck. So thank you very much for your participation. I wish you all very well in the rest of your week and look forward to your comments. Please look for our post-webinar survey that will be following later today. Thank you, everyone. Very much appreciate your participation.